Hello and welcome to Presentation 2 of Unit 1, Overcoming Barriers to Effective Communication. This is the happy presentation where, after seeing just how much is involved in communicating effectively in the first presentation, we're now going to look at how you can overcome some of those obstacles and be more effective. We'll look at attitudinal matters, the importance of listening, and then psychological factors. So let's start with attitude. And the first is one that I mentioned at the end of the first presentation, which is just to recognize that communicating well is a skill. It's encoding your message into the correct words is not something that comes easily or naturally or just happens automatically. It's something that you have to give your whole focus to, your whole attention, and spend enough time to get the right words. Then you have to choose an appropriate channel. Watch for feedback. If the person asks a question, take time to really understand the question and then answer it. Don't do what too many people do and reply to a question by just repeating what you said the first time, but louder and slower. Actually listen and answer the question. And recognize that the channel makes a difference to your message and choose an appropriate channel. This can be a way of overcoming physical barriers. If you're face to face, make sure you're close enough to hear each other. If there's noise outside, close the door. And again, a lot of this just comes from being aware that communication is something that you need to make an effort at. How many times have you been talking to someone and the noise made it almost impossible to concentrate on what they were saying, and yet they didn't do anything about it? So with the right attitude, make the effort to overcome those physical barriers. If your message has a fair bit of detail that needs to be referenced, then use a written form like an email. If it's something quick, use a text. If you need to get a message out to a bunch of people, then an email or a group presentation might be appropriate. But using the right channel can do a lot to overcome the physical barriers that might get in the way of your message. And the final attitudinal factor is being audience focused. And this is just a question of being aware of who your audience is and pitching your message appropriately. And again, this is something that seems really obvious, and yet if you think of your experience in the workplace, it gets overlooked so often. In the reading, I mentioned how we had a good briefing from our VP Admin and Finance that was delivered to the college executive, so we suggested it should go to a wider audience. And he gave them exactly the same briefing, full of technical terms, full of detail that wasn't appropriate or relevant to a wider audience. And the presentation that had been superb for us just bombed because he didn't adapt his message to the audience. So putting yourself in your audience's shoes, how much do they know already? How much background do they have? What's their technical level? What's their attitude coming in? Are they receptive? Are you going to need to win them over? All of that will shape the wording that you use and how you pitch your message. And it is absolutely key. So just having a certain amount of empathy and emotional intelligence is actually quite a good communication skill. Okay, the second group we will look at is listening skills. And if you've been thinking about just how the whole communication cycle works with your message going out and feedback coming back, it won't surprise you that listening is actually one of the most vital skills in becoming an effective communicator. And it's something that we as leaders, I think, too often overlook. Because we're so focused on getting our message out and really persuading and making sure that everybody knows our vision, that we're really concentrating exclusively on the sending side of the message and not on listening to the feedback or receiving what other people are sending to us. And in this respect, active listening is really the key. And I think that's a phrase that gets used a lot, but I'm not sure everyone really knows what it means. And it's more than just being quiet and listening to the words that the other person is saying. When you're actively listening, what you are doing is not just taking in the words, but you are actively thinking about what the other person is saying, organizing it, summarizing it in your mind, separating out the key points, and looking for the message in the other person's words. If you are active listening, when the other person finishes sending their message, you will be able to repeat it back in your own words. And that's really the test. If you've just been taking in the other person's message without thinking about it, you might be able to repeat it back to them in their words, but all you're doing is a memory exercise. You haven't really understood what they've said. When you can actually rephrase their message into their own words, that's when you haven't just taken in their message, but you've actually made it your own. You've listened actively to what they've said, thought about it, extracted the key elements, and made them your own. And a good example of this in practice happened when I was at the University of Calgary. I was lucky enough to take a course from David Burkeson, who's one of our leading Canadian historians. And first day of class, it was clear that all of us in this lower level history class were incredibly excited to be taking a course from the great David Burkeson, because it wasn't a grad class, it was a second year class. And so as he started lecturing, we just started writing and wrote down every word that he said, because this was something special and we were not going to miss it. And he put up with that for about 10 or 15 minutes. And then he stopped at the whiteboard, put his marker down, looked at us, and he literally shouted, "Stop! Stop taking so many notes." And he said, "You're writing everything I say verbatim. That's not taking notes." He said, "What you have to do is hear what I'm saying, think about it, and then write down a summary." And with that, he stopped the class and proceeded to give us a 10-minute lesson in note-taking, which the gist of which was, if we weren't writing our notes in our own words, we weren't thinking about what he was saying and making it our own. In other words, we weren't actively listening. We were just transcribing what he said. And if you're just transcribing it, you may be able to repeat the message verbatim, but you haven't understood it. You haven't put it into your own mental framework. And I've never forgotten what he said, and it may be the best lesson in active listening that I've ever received. So, listening well and really actively listening, that might just be the single most important skill you can have as a good communicator. As the old saying goes, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. I think there's some wisdom there. Okay, let's finish off with some psychological factors. When I've talked about feedback, I've tended to speak about it in terms of the other person listening to you and then asking a question or sending a message back. But in fact, feedback is something that goes on, that in a face to face or a video conversation can go on continuously. And this is one of the real advantages over face to face or video conferencing over, say, a telephone call or an email, is that in these circumstances, with your eye contact, your expression, you can provide constant feedback even as the other person is sending their message. By leaning forward and looking interested, you can show you're paying attention. Your facial expression can show you're understanding it or you're totally confused. The amount of time, showing that you're willing to spend enough time to take the message, shows a willingness. And territory, I think, is an interesting nonverbal cue. It's where you send the message. And one of the really useful things that I found as manager and dean at a CS unit was to actually visit my reports in their offices. And you set a different tone for your message when you visit people at their place rather than fetching them, having them come to your office. So all of these can be useful ways of providing feedback beyond just the verbal. And it all helps grease the wheels to make more effective communication. And then finally, something that used to be emphasized a lot in this kind of course, but I think is perhaps less of a factor now, are cultural effects on communication. And in the reading, I mentioned several different axes. Some cultures are more formal, some are less. Some cultures are more collectivists, some are more individualist, some more extroverted, some quieter. And all of that's true, but in a modern globalized world, the fact is that a lot of those cultural differences just roll into the individual differences. Different people that you meet will be more or less formal, more or less quiet. They'll stand closer, they'll be comfortable standing closer or further away. And really, whether it's a cultural difference or an individual difference, you just have to watch the other person for their nonverbal cues, see what they're comfortable with, and adapt your communication style to that. And again, this goes back to that fundamental, that the key communication skill, aside from active listening, is just being aware that communicating well and effectively is something that takes an effort, that you have to focus on, and isn't something that happens automatically. So yeah, watch the other person, see how they respond. And of course, in a business setting, you're dealing with another adult. They're aware that you might have different cultural preferences, just as you're trying to be aware of their preferences. So there's nothing wrong with asking, is this appropriate? Would you like to take the conversation to this place? If you're not sure about what's appropriate for the other person or what they'd be comfortable with, just ask. You're both grown-ups. And by now, you know that it's worth making the effort. Okay, so there we've looked at attitudinal factors in communication with choosing the right channel, recognizing that it's a skill, the importance of active listening, and really thinking about what it means to be an active listener. That ability to put the other person's message into your own mental framework, be able to rephrase it in your own words. That's the test for when you've really understood the other person's message. And then finally, psychological factors, just being aware of your nonverbal cues. And again, a lot of it goes to having the right attitude to make the effort. If somebody comes to you while you're listening to music, take that earbud out. Give them the nonverbal cue that you're paying attention. and you too will become an effective and a persuasive communicator. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you in the next reading and the next presentation.